Welcome to our new series, Oxford Bite-Sized, bringing you a flavour of the Oxford Farming Conference each month from now until January. For those of you who are new to Oxford, a very warm welcome. I hope this taste of Oxford sees you return. And for those who have previously attended, thank you for supporting our new initiative. If you are wondering who I am, I'm Sally Williams, the Chairman of OFC 2021. My day job is dairy farming in the southeast of Scotland, and I never would have imagined I would be opening a conference session from Scotland, but it just goes to prove that OFC is truly UK-wide and able to flex with the times. And you will all be very pleased there's no smell function on your laptops and PCs, as I have literally just walked in from the cows. This year is the 75th Oxford Farming Conference. The conference started in 1936, and it has run annually ever since, except for the war years. A significant milestone by any measure, but all the more poignant given the current turbulence we are living through. OFC through the years has informed, challenged and inspired delegates, and this year will be no different. By looking back at our heritage, we have the opportunity to take stock, see how far we've come, or not, as the case may be, and move into our future decisively and with confidence. And this applies to both the conference and agriculture at large. Like every organisation that runs events, we have had to make some tough decisions in light of COVID-19. As a charity that runs a conference at break-even, we couldn't take the risk of organising a physical event and bearing the loss if we had to cancel. But it has presented us with an incredible opportunity. Given the current global events, it is so important to me that OFC practices what it preaches. Our diversity in agriculture session last year was a highlight of conference, tackling truths that may be uncomfortable for many, but need addressing nonetheless. The bite-sized series allow us to walk the walk by offering those sessions digitally and free of charge. Absolutely no one is excluded. We are inclusive and accessible to all. In the coming months and years, this will prove essential, instilling collaboration and cooperation across our industry for the betterment of all. The Council of OFC is made up of 10 diverse and I am honoured, and I don't use that word lightly, to be working alongside them. Each bite-sized session will be delivered by a different director of OFC. Today's session is being chaired by Emily Norton. Emily has a phenomenal CV and is currently the Head of Rural Research for Savills. It is my great pleasure to hand over to Emily to start her session, taking a title from the 1930s, The Business Organisation of Farming. Emily.
Sally, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it is an absolute honour and slightly terrifying to be here doing this for the first time under these circumstances. I think the key thing that we really reflected on in planning for these webinars is quite how prescient so many of the historical titles of the Oxford Farming Conference were for the modern day. So being Muggins, I elected to go first in hosting these series of webinars and took a title from the 1930s. And 1939 was actually the fourth Oxford Farming Conference. And any of the previous three titles, I think, equally could have translated into today, focusing on things to do with the mechanisation of farming and indeed soil health. However, 1939, the Business Organisation of Farming. Now there's this fantastic little book all about the history of the Oxford Farming Conference, and it makes it clear that the business organisation of farming clearly something that is of equal relevance into the 60s or any decade since, but the conference organiser, C.S. Orwin, we're told, had confirmed that the programme had been drawn up in the belief that the future well-being of agriculture would depend at least as much on reorganisation within the industry as on changes in official policies. And it really strikes a note now as we face this moment of agricultural transition, looking forwards across the next 5 years and everything that we're being presented with in terms of policy, to think that these concepts and thoughts are just as relevant as they are today. So before we get stuck into our speakers, who I will introduce briefly, I would just like to play, if I may, a couple of voices from people who were farming in 1939. And my sincere thanks to contacts on Twitter for providing these voices amongst their sort of senior relatives. So Marcus, perhaps you could play those.
So when you moved to Clifton in 1937, I mean, you'd only be 15, I suppose. But who sort of decided what to grow or what crops to grow? Did you just sort of carry on doing what was done before?
I think we carried on and did what was best for us.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't ever remember us not knowing how to go.
No.
If you're on potato land, we invariably grew 20, 30 acres of spuds.
Yes.
Your corn, you'd have a Dutch barn of 6 bays, which was a day's thrashing,
Yes.
and you'd grow 6 fields, or enough to fill the barn and probably a couple of ricks outside.
Yes.
And I suppose it was mostly based on a head of cows
Yeah.
and milking.
My father went broke in 1937 and moved from Shropshire, where he had a small poultry farm, into Worcestershire, where he came onto a rented hill farm of about 50 acres. He came with £735 in his pocket, and therefore could not afford any labour at that time. And so at 9 years old, I was the labourer, together with my mother, and we managed to, between us, to milk about 6 cows at that time. We had 2 horses, and as I say, about 50 acres. There was a bit of a chicken house. This went on for 2 or 3 years while Father established himself as somebody who knew a bit more about farming than others. And so he gradually accumulated more land. But in the meantime, things were very, very hard indeed. It was very difficult to sell milk except to and of course only to the milk board at that time. And so we were price takers. So Father decided that he was going to grow vegetables for the nearby RAF camp and become a price maker. And this was what really set Beckett going. We developed as and went from there.
It's incredibly moving. I found incredibly moving to listen to those voices of, the farming depression that was ongoing during the 1930s, and to think that that was the origin of the Oxford Farming Conference, that feeling that things were so bad that something really needed to happen, and bringing people together to talk about farming, to talk about mechanisation, the changes that needed to happen were critical, and just as critical and relevant today. Now, to my panel, thank you so much. Also, just to mention the 2 voices mentioned there, Alan Beckett, who's just turned 90, from Beckett's Farm Shop, based in Withall in Worcestershire, and Bob Leedham, who was 17 in 1939, farming at Clifton Hall near Tamworth. So thank you to both of those for contributing that. So no further ado, on to my guests. We have got a fantastic lineup of speakers who I hope will give a really diverse range of views about the business of farming in a current day and age. We have George Dunn, who's the Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association. Welcome. Sarah Jane Lang, Chief Exec of Scottish Land and Estates. Thank you. Gus Selby, a fellow Nuffield scholar of mine, institutional ag investor as well, who I hope has got some great views to contribute here. And also delighted to be welcomed by Christine Taken, recently reappointed as a groceries code adjudicator. Used to be in farming, despite what her best claims to ignorance might be, as we're hoping to get under the skin of this topic going forwards. Right, no further ado. Most farming businesses are not profitable without subsidy. And Environment Secretary George Eustace said on BBC Farming Today, just on the 14th of May, that he wants the industry to stand on its own 2 feet after the agricultural transition. You know, guys, what does this really mean for the future of UK farm businesses? You know, and reflecting on your experience of working with UK farm businesses, what are the key strengths and weaknesses that we've got going on at the moment? Perhaps, George, I can start with you.
Okay, Emily, and thanks for having me on. I think a real strength of our farming businesses are the people involved in those farms, and I've been amazed over 30 years that I've been working with farmers in this industry about their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their reaction to change and their ability to solve problems. So I think we've got an amazing resource in the farming community that we have as one of the major strengths. And for weaknesses, I'm going to say the people too. And the reason why I'm saying that is because some of the biggest issues that I deal with in my role with the Tenant Farmers Association is when families implode, farm families implode. We have a predominantly farm family focused industry, and everybody thinks they will do the right thing by one another, and they don't write things down, and they're not clear with one another, and we're often trying to make sure that people write down their business plans, write down issues around occupation, who's using what assets, what the partnership is. And also 2 other groups of people that I would bring in, and you would expect me to say this, landlords. Landlords need to think longer term. 90% of our farm business tenancies in England and Wales are less than 5 years. That's not good for our industry. And landlords agents, Emily, need also to think longer term and to be facilitators, not blockers.
Thank you very much for that. I will duly report back to some of my peers. Gus, what about you and your perspective, your history here?
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. I would make a point up front in the sense that I don't think there's a singular business model that sits across UK agriculture at the moment. You know, there are many different ones, and whilst the family farm concept, I think, dominates the broader sector and covers a number of those different business models, it in itself is changing very rapidly and has been changing for a while, which brings me on to a second point around the industry's change. You know, this continuous change probably since the Industrial Revolution, often driven by technological advance, you know, has seen a number of key trends across the system over many decades. And 3 that I'd point out, I think, are farm sizes, you know, and the steady consolidation of farm size over time, largely driven by technology. But I think that in itself has interestingly slowed over the last 10 years, largely because, in my view, the value to return ratio, what real estate people would call the capitalization rates in agriculture, have got so low that it's been hard to justify the investments to take on further acquisitions. And most farm growth has taken place by rent rather than acquisition recently. I mean, a second theme or trend at the moment gathering more attention is the demographics. You know, the average age of operating farmers is now sitting at 60 years old. And there's a big chunk above that who have no intention of retiring and don't have succession plans in place. And at the other end of the industry, and we'll talk about this later, I know, there's a worrying shortage of young farmers, you know, in the under 35 category and also coming into the sector. But, you know, back to the question around strengths and weaknesses, I think UK farming has some great strengths, some of which George has pointed to in terms of resilience. I think the skills profile is very high on an international basis. I think the R&D and some of the technological developments that are going on around it are very interesting as well. I would say, you know, the loss of colleges over the last 20 years or so is a trend moving, or a headwind in that sense. And, you know, getting onto a few of the weaknesses, I think some of these structural challenges around the demographics, around the farmland market, which I think at the moment is being supported by tax legislation, provide challenges as to where the industry goes in the next chapter.
Thank you. That's so raised a lot of questions. And before we move on to our next two contributors, just to point out that anybody watching can ask questions and submit those questions through the chat function. You will just need to re-enter your password first so that you can enter that question. So please do contribute later on in the debate if you want to. Christine, if I can move on to you. You've long experience of working within the industry and working at all sorts of different levels of farm business structure. So, what do you perceive to be the strengths and weaknesses now?
Well, I start off by saying I agree with Gus that there is no such thing as a UK farm business model. But I think that what we've got today has been hugely influenced by the subsidy structure. And I would say that fresh fruit and veg businesses, poultry, pigs, the largely unsubsidised sectors, are in a very different place. And I think many of our fruit and veg businesses are globally leading, and they're run similarly to some of the best fast-moving consumer goods businesses, which I have also worked in, with a very sharp focus on the market, their consumers, their people, corporate social responsibility, and are able to respond rapidly to market demand. And in contrast, I believe that arable and livestock farming have been constrained by subsidy legislation and everybody, frankly, having an opinion on what they should be doing. And I think it's hampered one of the biggest strengths of UK farmers, which is entrepreneurship. And I think, like any business, a farmer's got to play to its unique resources, and a one-size-fits-all subsidy system has hurt that. But I think one of our biggest weaknesses in the UK is our reluctance to cooperate and to use the strength of numbers to purchase and sell better, and to effectively contract out areas, which is what we do in FMCG all the time, such as admin, so that the business can focus on the things where they're really good at and where they're skilled. And we do this to an extent in the UK, but we are decades behind New Zealand and continental Europe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And Sarah Jane, finally to you.
I'm just thinking about in terms of panel debate, Emily, you're going to get an awful lot of agreement between your entire panel, because I would agree with everything that George, Gus and Christine have just said. And if I can just touch on that diversity, because I do think that diversity of business model is probably the key strength of UK farming. And I think it would allow us to become an even bigger strength as we can move away from CAP, as we look at changing consumer habits and new markets for carbon, natural capital and food production. The diversity of business model that we have allows us to adapt, and it allows us to be a resilient industry. But as Christine said, that diversity can become a weakness because we become fragmented. As a sector, we do have much lower cooperation between farmers than you see in any other country. And that's a real concern, especially when we start moving to landscape scale approaches to delivering and rewarding natural capital. The fragility of our business models north of the border, I do think needs a mention, especially in the Scottish livestock sector. The growing gap between the top quartile and the lower quartile of Scottish farming is a massive concern for us at the moment. And Gus talked about return on capital, and if you look at the very low return on capital, I think the latest study showed that in 1819, half of all farmers had a negative return on capital. How do you attract new blood? How do you attract new interest to an industry where the financial reward can be so low? CAP has acted as a safety blanket. It has smothered innovation at times. In Scotland, we have this phrase, it's I-beam. And I think that probably sums up one of the weaknesses in Scottish farming and indeed UK farming as a whole. There are many farmers who are unable to consider change because there is no resilience in their current business model, and they can't exit the sector with dignity because there's no give, there's no spare cash to allow them to do that. Gus mentioned colleges. I do think we need to have a nod towards our world-leading academic institutions. We are producing some of the best research when it comes to productivity and animal and plant disease in the world. but we're not taking full advantage of that at the moment in UK agriculture. We're not really transferring that academic knowledge to practical implementation. And to be honest, we're hampered by government policy in relation to GM. So we have consumers who want more from us, they want better from us, but we are hampered by, as someone said, interference by policymakers, politicians and others who are keen to get involved in farming like they don't get involved in any other industry in Britain.
Thank you. There's a really wide range of views there, and I'm not sure you all necessarily agree on all of this. And there's an awful lot of strands there that I really want to pick up on. This idea of politicians being excessively involved in the business of farming and the way that policy has intervened in business management. I'm really interested in that. If we're now facing a future without income support, without that idea of income coming from the basic payment scheme, and any returns have to come from a marketplace, what does that look and feel like for farming businesses? Is that something that we're actually equipped to deal with? I don't mind who wants to go on this. George, perhaps?
Emily, I think what I would say is that the deal that we have had, roughly speaking, between the British public and the farming community is that the BPS, the single payment scheme as was, and the support of the CAP is almost like the deal that has been done between consumers and producers to provide food at affordable prices to consumers at the point of purchase at the costs that we are having to produce that at. Now, if we are saying that we're going to be removing a lot of that support, then we will need to see a stepped change in the extent to which primary producers are valued and are rewarded for the work that they are doing. Because quite frankly, at the moment, there isn't the profit for those businesses to be able to continue. And despite what Christine said about some of the sectors being able to do better, some of those are better structured naturally in the way that they operate than broadacre arable or livestock production or whatever. And we wouldn't want to see some of those systems imported into those types of arrangements. And I think there's a real role, and Christine will disagree with me, I know, for an expanded groceries code adjudicator here to look at the whole of the supply chain to ensure that there is a fair reward to primary producers if we are going to be leaving that type of support behind.
Christine?
I think I've got to come in straight away there. First of all, to say that the role of the groceries code adjudicator is to oversee the groceries supply code of practice, which I'll call the code, and that came out of 2 Competition and Markets Authority investigations. It has nothing to do with price. It is only about what in the over on the continent is called unfair trading practices, and it basically it requires people to pay on time. So whatever the contract is, the code makes sure that if you're due to be paid in 30 days, you get paid in 30 days. So it's about being paid on time. It's not about varying. That makes sure you can't vary agreements retrospectively. It means if you are going to vary agreement looking forward, it's got to have reasonable notice, and not allowing things like retailers telling suppliers which packaging supplier to use and then getting a backhander from the packaging supplier. So they're all practices which I think I'm slightly ashamed to say were rife, and I think now have largely stopped. It's done. Well, it is. There's nothing to do with price, and there's no interference with anything that I can do on price. And I think my concern about taking, say, the groceries code adjudicator remit and taking it as it stands to the farm gate is that I don't think it's addressing the problems that I hear from farmers, which are things about fair returns, and that some of the practices that the code is prohibiting are not practices that are actually occurring.
So this is a really interesting point, because George Eustace in that BBC Farming Today interview went on to talk about the sections of the agriculture bill that nobody's really talking about at the moment, which is sections 24 to 28, which is all about contract terms and fair dealing in consumer supply chains. So, Sarah Jane, I don't know if any of this is being debated in Scotland as well. Obviously, the agriculture bill is English legislation, and this concept of transitioning from income support to relying on on supply chains to underpin the risk in food production is a monumental change that I don't think many people in the industry have really started to think about yet. Perhaps you can reflect on what's happening north of the border to start with, Sarah Jane, in that regard, and then Christian, I'd be really interested to hear your views on what that legislation might mean for your kind of role going forwards.
Yeah, north of the border, we're a good few years behind. At the moment, the message is stability. So we're continuing as we currently are, and all the signs are that our transition period will be much longer. But certainly at the moment, the Scottish Government doesn't really want to talk about anything beyond 2024, and we're putting in place legislation to allow us to continue to do what we're currently doing. But I think we've got a lot of work to do up here as well. George talked about that societal contract. And the reality is that there is no direct correlation between the amount of money that a farmer is paid and the price of produce on the supermarket shelves. So consumers themselves don't really know what support is for that underpins Scottish farming and UK farming. They value all the non-market goods that our members and farmers provide, but they're not really sure what the support is for. And I think we talk about moving to a new system, and I think George talked about the societal contract, and I think that does have to be the basis. But that basis has to be wider than food production. It has to be about recognising the value of the natural capital and the natural land management carried out by land managers across the UK, and there has to be some reward. We have to kind of move away from that compensatory approach to one which rewards what farmers deliver for the UK as a whole, societal and environmental as well as economic.
And Christine, briefly, the future, I totally accept that your role at the moment is not set up to think about price, but in terms of the future direction of supply chain regulation, what's your insight on where that could go and how it could protect or enable better business relationships with supply chains?
It's incredibly difficult because the Competition and Markets Authority is there to protect the end consumer, and within most our recent careers, there was an initiative driven by the NFU to increase prices back to dairy farmers, and the Competition and Markets Authority intervened and actually ended up fining retailers who had done exactly what the NFU wanted them to do, which was to increase price to consumers to give more back to the farmer, and they intervened and fined them. So we maybe even have to start with, has the Competition and Markets Authority got the right remit? Because they are not there to protect businesses, they're there to protect consumers. And interestingly, I was asked to go and present to the committee of the Irish Parliament on their unfair trading practices legislation, which is taking pretty much the UK code and trying to make it go their way back to the farm gate. And virtually all the questions were, but I don't see how this increases returns to farmers. And I was saying, it is not set up to increase returns to farmers. It's set up to make sure that people are treated fairly and predictably, and so they know what's going to happen to them. So I think we just need to be a bit careful that people talk about these things that are being done to increase the returns, when actually you look at it and you think, how is it going to do it?
Yeah, George?
Emily, I think Christine has done a really good job in telling us what her current job description is. I was arguing that we needed to be amending that job description, and I realise that Christine is not able to write a new job description for her current role. But the point that she makes about consumer prices, I'm not asking for an increase in the retail or food service price. We just need a better sharing of the margin down the supply chain, and that's what's not happening at the moment. There's sufficient waste in the processing and retail and food service sectors that means that farmers aren't adequately rewarded. And as Sarah Jane said, the amount of consumer price that is paid to the farmer is massively small in comparison to what consumers might think.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking back to those voices at the start, one of the things that struck me about what Bob Leedon was saying was that what he produced was very much based on the natural carrying capacity of the land. So if you had land that was suitable for potatoes, you grew some potatoes. If you had a Dutch barn that was 6 bays, you grew enough corn to put in those bays. And those factors, those limitations on productivity were very much based around the infrastructure of the farm that you possessed. And I find it very interesting now, we have this slight split between those parts of the industry, pigs and poultry perhaps, which haven't been incentivised through subsidy, haven't been protected through subsidy, sorry, but aren't necessarily attached to the land, and these broadacre systems, which are very much dependent still, despite all of our cleverness and technology, that are dependent upon the natural and productive capacity of the land. And I suppose where I'm sort of confused and thinking about this in terms of where we're going with all of this policy and all of these different incentives going forwards relates to some of the things that Sarah Jane was alluding to just then about natural capital and this investment in the nature, in that fundamental productive capacity of what we have. George, equally really interested in your views on this from a tenant's perspective, from an occupier's perspective. What relevance is natural capital if we've got institutional investors who want to invest in the well-being of the land and the environmental capacity of the land and those features? How does that sort of interact with the occupation of land, in particular where the occupation and the production of food may not even touch the land in the future? So Gus, I know you've sort of thought a lot about this in relation to institutional capital being attracted into our sector. So, you know, what's attracting these guys with big budgets to come and think about these additional and co-benefit values from land?
So I'll address that question, Emily, with a couple of points up front. The first being that, in my view, you know, the era of cheap food, which has predominated, you know, in the post-war period and certainly over the last 20, 30 years, I think has had a couple of externalities around it. I think, one, the environment has borne a lot of the cost of that cheap food, and that's partly because of the structuring. I think, you know, the dominance of the retail profile in the UK sector, and not enough of the share in the supply chain, you know, flowing back to the farmers. And I think that is an issue that everyone recognizes at the moment and is at the heart of this whole natural capital focus. I think we've also got an opportunity now at this juncture as we shift the common agricultural policy across to a British agricultural policy to address these issues. But I have to say, you know, I haven't got a lot of confidence in the policy alignment on these issues at this stage. I think there's a reasonable effort being made around the agricultural bill. But for me, the elephant in the room is the ag policy profile is hardly talking to the health policy profile. We spend £3.5 billion a year on agricultural support, and we're going to spend 145 billion on health on the NHS next year. 30% of that is going to be dietary related expenditures, you know, around diabetes, around hip replacements, etc., etc. And the fact that those two policies are not talking to each other, you know, really worries me at this juncture of great opportunity. I mean, the other elephant in the room, obviously, is this trade policy. You know, if we, in my view, if we sneak through a profile that allows US and Brazilian product to infiltrate the UK market, we're on a hiding to nowhere. It's just going to exacerbate that whole issue around, you know, the environment bearing a higher profile, you know, of the cost. So, you know, those are some 30,000 foot views on it. I think when you move into the natural capital concept, it is definitely not just a fad. I think the challenges with it are measuring some of the benefits around that. And there are people, as you allude to, both within the industry and also within the investment sector, paying a lot of time and attention. I should also say in the government, paying a lot of time and attention to trying to get towards a credible measurement system on the, you know, the key tenets of natural capital as it sits.
So Sarah Jane, I mean, Scottish Wildlife Trust promoting this 1 billion investment programme into natural capital in Scotland. I mean, it does seem to be sort of, you know, one route through the budgetary issue is to try and leverage this kind of thinking around private investment into land and into land management.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we shouldn't always just look to government to public funding for what we deliver from land. There's a massive private market out there, either from institutional investors or others. And if you look at the climate change agenda, Scottish and UK farmers are best placed to deliver the climate change targets. We are pilloried every day, wrongly, I think, by those who don't really understand how the system works. But we can store carbon, in our grassland, in our soils, in our peatland, in our trees, agroforestry, in our farms. There's huge opportunities for us there. And just to kind of pick up on what Angus said, it is about outcomes. CAP kind of drove us down this kind of very audit type approach, where we're rewarded for acres or activity, but it wasn't really about the societal outcomes. And I think it is when you join it up with the other outcomes, the health outcomes, the natural capital, the climate change outcomes. That's where farming can come into its own.
And George, I mean, this is the bit where I kind of worry about this most. If you're occupying land, how are you adequately, occupied as opposed to owning land, how are you adequately rewarded for the environmental benefit delivered? If this is where the future some of this stuff is going, and you're being paid to store carbon in soil, which is the $64 million question, but you've only got a 5-year FBT, how does that even work? I mean, it just, at the moment, the policy space doesn't seem to be right to me.
Yeah, Emily, you're absolutely right. And I have found actually that obviously I deal with a substantial number of environmental NGOs and representatives of organizations like that. But the most passionate people that I have spoken to about landscape and biodiversity and wildlife have been the farmers whose farms that I've visited for many issues, who have been very keen to show me what they have been doing on their farms in relation to landscape, biodiversity and wildlife. And I spoke to a Dartmoor farmer yesterday who said that she had seen much more wildlife on the moor, having not had the public access pressure over the previous few weeks. So there's a clear desire amongst our members to be involved in this. But you're absolutely right. When you have got a time-limited farm business tenancy, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, how do you think about some of these natural capital issues into the long term? Some landlords, like the Duchy of Cornwall, the Prince Charles's estate, is looking at longer-term tenancies and building natural capital into that. And we need many more landlords to be looking at the beacon of light that the Duchy of Cornwall is providing there. And Duchy of Lancaster is another one who's thinking about that. But we still have too many landlords letting on a short-term basis. And we've also got the issue of landlords' reserve rights. Landlords are traditionally taking the right to those natural capital elements so that they can take advantage of those in the marketplace rather than tenants. So we do need a much more joined up approach here and longer term agreements.
Brilliant, thank you. Conscious of the time, we're slipping on, and I've been reliably informed that there's a whole heap of questions which have come in. So thank you, World, who are listening. Sally, could you fish through and find one for us?
Yes, and I will say thank you very much to everybody who is taking part. My screen is absolutely rammed full of questions, and I apologise in advance. There's just no way we'll be able to go through. But what has been wonderful so far is clearly our panel are psychic, because an awful lot of the questions are being asked and then answered without us having to even voice them. So full marks to Sarah, to Christine, to George and Gus. One of the interesting comments that has actually been addressed, and apologies, I'm just scrolling back through, was the one, would consumers or politicians ever accept that higher prices for food could be in their interest? And it was really interesting to hear Gus's take on that. But moving on to one which is very topical at the moment is regarding new entrants. So question slightly to Angus, but the wider panel, about your shortage of young farmers. Is that within the current farming gene pool or new entrants from non-farming origin? how important is the latter for Christine's entrepreneurship, and therefore what is the role of ethnic minorities in farming and the food industry post-COVID. And apologies, I'm going to leap in quickly to say lots of people are asking, is this going to be available after? And this session is being recorded and will be released on the Oxford Farming Conference website thereafter. So on you go with the question now.
So, Christine, could you go on this first? Because I know you're heavily involved in skills development across the industry, as well as your role as the GCA.
Yes, I chair a business called MDS, which has been going for over 30 years, and we recruit people directly from university, and they work for us for 2 years, and we give them 4 jobs in 4 different businesses across the fresh produce and food supply chain. And those 4 jobs will be with our members. We've got members from Sainsbury's and Aldi through to berry gardens. We have asparagus growers. You know, we have growers as well as the big fresh produce processing businesses in between. And the people that we recruit for their leadership potential. We generally get about 40 applicants for every place on the scheme, so we're not short of applicants. We obviously go around the universities, do careers fairs. They're obviously now virtual, but that's working well for us as well. We've still got no shortage of applicants. And we recruit people who are archaeologists, linguists, chemists, as well as people clearly who've done some form of farm business related course. And whilst they work for us for 2 years, we train them as well. And at the end of that 2 years, they are highly employable by our members. And in fact, our members are often fighting over them. But about 85% of them end up getting jobs in the membership. But those who don't still seem to stay in our industry. And I'm hugely proud after 30 years. I mean, we've even got members of MDS now who were trainees at an earliest when they first left university. So in terms of recruiting bright young people from huge numbers of backgrounds into our industry, as opposed to farming specifically, we are having no shortage of people wanting to join us as members or join us as trainees. And I'm hugely encouraged by it. I mean, we've doubled in size in 3 years, hugely encouraged at the interest and the way that it's going. So I think we have to market ourselves to these young people. They will come into our industry and they will stay, but they generally don't know an awful lot about us. And if we always talk about farming and we have images of people with string tied around their trousers, as opposed to the technology that we work with, we will be putting people off. It's fantastic industry. We've got full employment and we're desperate for new people.
So clearly employment is one route, but George, tenancy is the other traditional route into the industry?
Yeah, tenancy is a traditional route into the industry, but I would agree with Christine that not everybody can be a business owner in their own right. You know, you can't just create business opportunities for everybody who wants to be in farming, and employment is a route that we need to continue to progress and to promote and to provide opportunity for. Tenancies are a really important way in. My concern is it's not so much about new entrants, and I think we get fixated with new entrants because I think there are plenty of routes in for the first rung on the ladder: a grazing license, a county council small holding, a profit of pond or whatever. There are ways in. The problem is, how do you make the next step? How do you progress beyond what you've got? And too much of our policy on structures is about a conveyor belt approach. So we put people on one end, they do a short period of time on a short tenancy, and then they fall off the other and don't have another opportunity. So I think we need to be looking at this not just from a new entrants perspective, but how does this look from progression right the way through the industry? How do we provide that route through the industry rather than just a new entrants point?
So Gus, I know you've looked at this specifically in your Nuffield studies, you know, the structures that we can learn from other industries where we're matching, because obviously the cost of capital coming into this industry is enormous if you want to buy land to start farming. So, you know, perhaps your insight on this, you know, what are the other routes to attract new entrants into the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And look, it's encouraging to hear, you know, an optimistic take, especially on the MDS side. I think also, you know, to George's point, the caveat between ownership and tenancy, ownership and management is an important one. What I would say is that the statistics, certainly at the ownership level, tell a worrying story in terms of the number of young people who are coming in from outside the industry in any sort of ownership capacity. And this is not, it's not limited to the UK. This pattern is prevalent in the US, it's prevalent in Canada, it's prevalent in Australia. And the barrier to entry for me is probably the capital profile, the key barrier to entry. And just for a bit of context, I think in the UK over the last 15, 20 years, the amount of capital required to start up as a new entrant, admittedly on an ownership basis, and this applies to both average farm size or optimal farm size, has increased sixfold, 6x over a 15 to 20 year period. In Canada, it's increased 13x. In the US and Australia, it's roughly 7x. Either way, and this is largely because land prices have moved so dramatically over that period. It's virtually impossible for a new entrant to come in and actually acquire land outright. And so the alternative routes are either to come in and work their way up through a meritocratic management system and hope that the opportunity comes down the line to switch across, or to bring in capital from some other sector over time, or to go to the bank of mum and dad. But it is that barrier to entry is very distinct. And the only other conclusion I'd say from my Nuffield element was that I wasn't that encouraged by the amount of initiatives out there. Or rather, there are many initiatives, but I wasn't encouraged by the overall aggregate scalability or impact of those initiatives at this stage. I think it might be slowing the trend, but it's certainly not turning it around.
And Sarah Jane, I'm sure you will have a view on the accountability of land ownership and the situation up in Scotland.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things there. One, I think Gus talked about the scalability of some of the initiatives, and I think you're absolutely right. Where you create artificial new entrant schemes, I think that's where you run into the problems that both you and George have talked about. That people start their farms, there's then nowhere for them to go. The reality is they're not sustainable business models. So what we're starting to see in Scotland is a rise in joint venture schemes, true partnerships where there's shared risk and reward. And that seems to be bringing in new expertise, new people to the industry, new way of thinking, greater diversity of gender, of background. I think the tenant farming relationship, I do think needs recalibrated, the tenant landlord relationship. We have suffered in Scotland from government interference in tenancy legislation. And I think what you have to make sure is, this should be about a partnership. And that's where, the tenant landlord strength lies, as George says, in longer term planning. Landlords can't farm all the land themselves. Tenants are critical to a healthy, vibrant tenant farming sector in Scotland, but we've not got the balance right, and a lot of that is, as I say, is fear because of retrospective changes to tenancy legislation. I think if you take that away, you see a willingness for landlords and tenants to kind of work at that long term.
So Christine, you mentioned earlier about sort of efficiencies in business and kind of contracting out the bits that you're not necessarily good at. I mean, are there parallels here?
Oh, I don't know about. I tell you what I was thinking when Sarah Jane was talking is that certainly when I was farming at the co-op, that there was a Scottish scheme that was giving, I think, 40% grants to anybody under 35 to go into free-range egg production. And you don't need much land to go into that. And it was enabling huge numbers of second generation people to actually put something up on their parents' farm and to be independent themselves. And that's something that, I suppose, leading on to the question you just asked me, I would challenge anybody to be a highly competent arable and livestock farmer and a highly competent free-range egg producer. So I think actually concentrating on doing one thing really well is important. But I think I was more talking about before about from a purchasing point of view that don't assume that you can actually farm brilliantly and run a fantastic back office and always be able to sell and buy at the right price. And I think that's where, going right back to a comment of George's earlier, it's about buying power. Farmers really, small farmers have zero buying power from no buying power, no selling power. And that's when working together helps these things so much more.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask a really controversial question, but I won't. I'll go back to Sally, see if anybody else has got some controversial questions that we could ask. Don't forget to unmute.
Schoolgirl error, apologies. So the first is a comment from Nick Tapp. Business relationships and structures tend to be locked in by the tax system, which stifles innovation. Structural innovation is relentlessly stifled. And followed up by a question, please, from Peter Clark. How can we limit the damage that politicians can do by interfering in a subject, agriculture, that they do not understand, along with the major broadcasters and broadsheet producers who peddle untruths?
Who would like to go first on this one? Emily, I'll speak to the tax issue, if that's okay. I think there is a tendency for tax to drive too much of the practicality of the way in which land ownership and land occupation plays out. And we have seen it in respect of owner-occupiers who don't want to carry on farming the land themselves, but want to retain the tax advantages of being a farmer in their own right, and sometimes enter into contract farming arrangements, which are perhaps more like tenancies than contract farming, and where the contractor doesn't really have the wider natural capital in mind when they are doing that contracting. So I think there's a concern there about, you might even call it tax avoidance in the way in which some of those schemes are operated. But within the landlord-tenants system, I think we do need the government to address the inheritance tax issue, because there is a real fear, going back to what Sarah James was saying about fear in the landlord community, about losing important taxation benefits. If the government were to say, we will incentivize longer term tenancies and we will lock in the landlord's tax liability on day one of that tenancy, then we might see some greater degrees of flexibility and longer term agreements between landlords and tenants.
But I mean, Gus, taxation reliefs on land are not a uniquely British issue. So, you know, what's the global perspective?
Yeah, it's a discussion point in the US at the moment. You know, the US and Canadian farmland markets tend to operate on a purer basis of value from productivity. You know, here in the UK, there's a whole lot of secondary drivers, you know, call them recreational drivers, that I think have pushed land prices as well. But there is clearly an issue, as George alludes to, around the inheritance tax profile that is slowing the supply of land onto the market. You know, volumes of land transactions generally change hands 2% a year, which is roughly once every 50 years, once every 2 to 3 generations, whether you're looking at markets here or in the US or Australia. In the UK, they've slowed to about 1% at the moment. And I think that volume profile is definitely a result of the inheritance tax profile, but also don't forget the rollover relief. You know, for development planning at the moment, the rollover relief is funneling a lot of capital straight back into the demand side of the market.
But if we have ready availability of the occupation of land coming to the market, so we can still get new entrants in, does it matter what the ownership profile is?
Emily, I would say no, it doesn't matter. I mean, an awful lot of UK business doesn't own the asset within which they carry out that business. So it's not necessary to own the asset to run the business. But we do think that the taxation policy within which decisions of land ownership and land occupation are taken have not been part of the discussion around the way in which the future of agriculture proceeds. So it has been amongst groups like ours and professional bodies, but the Treasury doesn't engage in the same way as you might get other bits of government to engage in it. So we need the Treasury to think about this within the long term.
Sarah Jane, does it matter who owns land and what the taxation advantage or disadvantages are?
Taxation does drive behaviour, and as George says, you know, there have been some quite perverse business decisions taken because of taxation policy. But you know, TFA, STFA, ourselves, CLA have for a number of years put forward proposals to the Treasury which could have a positive impact on tenant farming and farming in general. And as George says, we have been surprised that there hasn't been more interest from the Treasury. I agree with him. You don't have to own the land to farm well, to farm productively. And if there's taxation blockages, then it's incumbent on the Treasury to look and see what those blockages are.
Brilliant, thank you. Sally, sorry, Gus, did you want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to make one other point on the tax profile, which is that if it is a key issue on valuation, and it is keeping values distorting them at an artificial high, then that's ultimately undermining the return profiles across the sector. So there is some return profile logic to moderating the land values, which comes back to the tax question.
Right. Nice.
Yeah, go, Christine.
I just wanted there was a reference to political interference, and I think the trouble is that we as an industry look to the politicians to solve our issues. And they're lobbied by everybody, and by definition, there's a whole number of people that are not going to be impressed by what the outcome is, and then they will class that as political interference. And I'm sort of reminded of a politician I had with my MP who became a minister for a short while in agriculture, but had also been a minister in motor industry. And he said that the motor industry is totally joined up. They look at their issues, they identify what needs to be done, and then they lobby government for that solution. And he said the agricultural industry is all over the place, and he just felt he got pulled in so many different directions. So I think my message is to look inwards first, and we'll tell the politicians what we want, as opposed to everybody lobbying them, and then we all say they're interfering.
Thank you. And I can't disagree in the slightest. The diversity of our industry is perhaps one of those problems, and also its sort of geographical profile, the fact that it's dispersed in the way that it is. Guys, I'm very close to 1 o'clock now, which is when we will be kicked off air because everybody will be finishing their sandwiches and need to get back to the day job. I just wanted you each, if you could, in the 2 minutes that are left, 30 seconds each, what does the farm business of the future look like? 5 years from now, what does farm business look like?
Who do you want to go? I would say larger. I think fresh produce businesses will get larger, and I think livestock and arable businesses will have it's almost like virtually larger. They may well still be small businesses, but they will be playing as if they're larger because they are cooperating or they're buying together. But everything will be much more powerful because that's the only way we're going to get the profits back.
Sorry, George, come on.
Sorry, Emily, my view would be that we will see an increasing loss of the middle ground. So I think there will be businesses that will get larger, but I think there will be an increasing number of smaller, more niche type businesses which will operate more plurally, so they will have diversification, have more farm income, but there'll be farmers in their hearts, but business people in their heads.
I like that. Sarah Jane.
Yeah, I think people will be farming well. They'll be producing not necessarily more, but they'll be producing better. And I think certainly in Scotland, I think you'll see a move to possibly more extensive grazing, even in our lowlands. And I think you'll see a shift to more data-driven approaches. People really understanding how their decisions affect outputs. I think that's still one of the biggest problems we have. People don't really follow through and understand the impact of their business decisions.
Thank you. Gus?
So I think it depends a lot on how the near-term policy profiles work out. But I'll tell you what I'd like to see. I'd like to see shorter supply chains. I'd like to see higher quality food. I'd like to see an emphasis on affordable rather than cheap food. And I'd like to see a 75% food security profile across the UK, which implies a more protectionist agenda. But I think that's the way that we get a fairer share of the dollar or the pound back to the farmer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled that all of you were able to join us for this. I think it's actually been really interesting to hear your views across this whole space. Clearly there's some massive challenges ahead, but I can pull hope and joy out of all of your visions that you've just described. And perhaps we will, through this process, through the Oxford Farming Conference, keep pulling ideas, keep pulling knowledge together, that we can then, as Christine has described, take a unified voice forwards in terms of asking for what we need. There is so much synergy there. So my sincerest thanks to you all for participating. And Sally, if I may, at exactly 1 o'clock, 1:01, sorry, hand back to you.
I'm just checking, I have unmuted this time. Thank you very much, Emily, and to reiterate, thank you so much to our panel. That has been absolutely brilliant, and what a wonderful first session for Oxford Bite Size. As I've said already, the session has been recorded and will be uploaded to the OFC website just as soon as we possibly can. We're very grateful to our sponsors, Kubota and Sainsbury's. As was mentioned earlier as well, we are charity support of our sponsors, we would be unable to hold these events. I hope you've enjoyed today's session as much as we all have. The next session is on Thursday, the 2nd of July, and it has taken its theme from 1958 towards greater self-sufficiency, and it will explore food security, nature, and net zero. Can we have our cake and eat it? Chaired by another of this year's intake of new directors, Liz Bowles. The August Bite Size will be chaired by Tom Levitt with the 1960s theme of the case for expansion, and we're hoping to take you virtually on farm for this, so please stay tuned as more information is released. It is now 13:02 and we have done our best to keep it to an hour, so all it leaves me to say is thank you very much for joining us, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Bye everyone.